She saw everyone ignore the billionaire's elderly father until she helped him stand to give a speech. The grand ballroom of the Hawthorne Hotel buzzed with activity as New York's elite gathered for the annual charity gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables adorned with white roses and gold trim, while waiters in crisp black uniforms weaved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Amidst the sea of designer gowns and custom tuxedos, Abigail Porter stood out not for her appearance, but for her acute sense of observation. At 28, Abigail worked as an event coordinator for the Hawthorne, a position that granted her an insider's view of high society while remaining virtually invisible to those she served. Tonight, she wore a simple black dress, professional, elegant, but designed to blend into the background. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a neat bun, revealing a face that, while pretty, bore the subtle signs of someone who worked too hard and slept too little. "The Monroe party has requested another bottle of the Cristal," said a voice beside her. It was Jason, one of the bartenders, looking harried. Abigail nodded. "I'll take care of it." She moved efficiently through the crowd, stopping occasionally to straighten a centerpiece or direct a lost guest. The gala was a fundraiser for children's literacy, but from what she could observe, most attendees were more interested in being seen than in the cause itself. As she approached the bar to retrieve the champagne, her attention was drawn to a corner of the room where a commotion seemed to be brewing. At the center stood Jackson Hayes, the billionaire tech mogul whose company, Horizon Technologies, had revolutionized renewable energy storage. Hayes was tall and commanding, with salt and pepper hair and the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to power. Around him clustered admirers and business associates, all vying for his attention, but it wasn't Hayes who caught Abigail's eye. It was the elderly man seated at a nearby table, seemingly forgotten by the crowd. He sat alone, his hands resting on a wooden cane, watching the activity around his son, with a mixture of pride and resignation. While Jackson Hayes was surrounded by people eager for his attention, not a single person acknowledged the older man. Abigail recognized him from the event briefing. Walter Hayes, Jackson's father, a retired schoolteacher who had raised his son alone after his wife's early death. The contrast between father and son could not have been more stark, one commanding the room with his very presence, the other fading into obscurity despite sharing the same distinguished features. With the champagne forgotten, Abigail found herself walking toward the older man's table. It wasn't part of her job description, but something in his dignified solitude called to her. "Excuse me, Mr. Hayes," she said softly, approaching his table. "Would you like something to drink? Perhaps some water or coffee?" Walter looked up, surprise evident in eyes the same striking blue as his son's. "Well, now, that's very kind of you, young lady. Some coffee would be wonderful if it's not too much trouble." His voice was warm and carried the slight lilt of a southern accent, unlike his son's polished metropolitan tone. "No trouble at all," she replied with a genuine smile. "Cream or sugar?" "Black as midnight, please. Never could stomach anything else." As Abigail went to fetch the coffee, she noticed Jackson Hayes watching her interaction with his father. A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, crossing his face before he turned back to his conversation. When she returned with Walter's coffee, she found him attempting to stand, one hand gripping his cane tightly, the other pressing against the table for support. "Here, let me help you," she said, setting down the coffee and offering her arm. "Thank you, dear," Walter said, accepting her assistance. "These old legs don't cooperate like they used to. Been trying to catch my son's attention, but he's a busy man, always has been." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a father's understanding of his son's nature. It made Abigail's heart ache all the more. "I need to get up to that stage," Walter continued, nodding toward the podium at the front of the ballroom. "Jackson doesn't know it, but I'm supposed to introduce him tonight. The director thought it would be a nice surprise." Abigail glanced at her watch. The speeches were scheduled to begin in less than 5 minutes, and Jackson Hayes was still engrossed in conversation, oblivious to his father's struggle. "Let me help you to the stage," she offered, her arm steadying Walter as he stood. Together they made their way slowly across the room. Abigail could feel eyes turning toward them, a curious spectacle in a room where everyone moved with purpose and confidence. When they reached the 3 steps leading to the stage, Walter paused, a look of uncertainty crossing his face. "I don't know if I can manage those," he admitted quietly. Without hesitation, Abigail signaled to Mark, one of the security personnel standing nearby. "We need to help Mr. Hayes to the stage," she explained. Mark nodded, and together they supported Walter on either side as he climbed the steps. From the corner of her eye, Abigail saw Jackson Hayes finally notice what was happening. He excused himself from his group and started moving toward the stage, confusion evident on his face. Walter reached the podium just as the event director was preparing to begin the program. The director looked momentarily startled, then smiled in recognition. "Perfect timing, Mr. Hayes," she said, adjusting the microphone to accommodate Walter's shorter stature. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the room, "we have a special introduction for our keynote speaker tonight." The crowd grew quiet, all eyes now on the elderly man who stood before them with quiet dignity, Abigail still at his side. Jackson Hayes had stopped halfway to the stage, his expression unreadable. Walter cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried throughout the room with unexpected strength. "Most of you know my son as Jackson Hayes, the founder of Horizon Technologies and a leading innovator in sustainable energy. But before he was any of those things, he was just Jackie to me, a curious boy who took apart every appliance in our house to see how it worked." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Jackson remained frozen in place, his eyes fixed on his father. "What you may not know," Walter continued, "is that everything my son has built started with a promise he made to his mother on her deathbed, that he would use his brilliant mind to make the world better, not just richer. Tonight, as we raise money for children's literacy, I see him fulfilling that promise, because what could make the world better than giving children the power of words and ideas?" The room was completely silent now. Abigail felt Walter's hand tighten on her arm as he steadied himself. "I've watched my son climb to heights his mother and I could only dream of. I've seen him work until his hands bled and his eyes couldn't stay open. I've witnessed his failures and his triumphs. But nothing has made me prouder than seeing him remember where he came from and why he started." Walter's voice caught slightly, and Abigail instinctively moved closer to support him. She could see tears glistening in the eyes of many guests, including, to her surprise, several of the business associates who had been clustered around Jackson earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter said, his voice growing stronger, "it is my honor to introduce to you not just a brilliant businessman, not just a visionary, but the best son a father could ask for, Jackson Hayes." The applause was immediate and thunderous. Abigail helped Walter turn toward the steps where Jackson now stood, his composed facade cracking to reveal raw emotion. As father and son faced each other on that stage, Abigail knew she was witnessing a moment that transcended the artificial glamour of the evening, something real and powerful in a room built on appearances. What happened next would change the course of not just that evening, but of 3 lives forever entwined by a simple act of kindness in a room full of indifference. Jackson Hayes stepped forward, embracing his father with a tenderness that contradicted his public image as a ruthless business titan. The crowd's applause intensified, cameras flashed, and Abigail began to slip away, her momentary role in the spotlight complete. Her duty now was to return to the shadows of service, invisible once more. "Wait," Walter called after her, his voice cutting through the applause. "Young lady, please stay." Abigail froze, caught between professional protocol and the elderly man's request. Before she could decide, Jackson himself turned to her, his expression a complex blend of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. "Yes," he echoed his father's words. "Please stay." With a slight nod, Abigail moved to the side of the stage, close enough to assist if needed, but attempting to remain unobtrusive as Jackson took his place at the podium. She watched as the billionaire adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. "I had a speech prepared," Jackson began, his voice steady despite the emotion that had been evident moments before. 10 pages about innovation, investment, and the future of education technology." He paused, glancing at the note cards in his hand before deliberately setting them aside. "But I think my father just reminded us all of something more important than anything I had planned to say." From her position at the edge of the stage, Abigail could see Walter beaming with pride, one hand still resting on his cane, the other wiping discreetly at his eyes. "My father mentioned a promise I made to my mother," Jackson continued. "What he didn't tell you is that I nearly broke that promise. When I founded Horizon, it wasn't with some noble purpose in mind. I wanted to prove myself. I wanted success. I wanted—" He hesitated. "To be seen." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the polished corporate rhetoric they had expected from the evening's keynote speaker. It took 5 years of relentless work to build Horizon into something worth noticing. 5 years during which I rarely called home, rarely visited my father, rarely thought about anything but the next deal, the next innovation, the next rung on the ladder. Jackson's gaze drifted to Walter, then briefly to Abigail before returning to address the audience. Success came, and with it, a kind of blindness. I surrounded myself with people who wanted something from me: money, connections, validation. I became exactly what I thought I needed to be: untouchable, unstoppable, and increasingly alone. The ballroom was utterly silent now, the usual backdrop of hushed conversations and clinking glasses, completely absent as everyone hung on Jackson's unexpectedly personal words. 2 years ago, my father had a stroke, Jackson revealed, his voice dropping slightly. I was in Singapore closing a deal that would expand Horizon's reach into Asian markets. I didn't get the message until 18 hours later, and it took me another 12 to get back to New York. By the time I reached the hospital, he was already improving, already joking with the nurses, already forgiving me for not being there sooner. Abigail noticed Walter shifting uncomfortably, unused to being the subject of such public disclosure. She moved subtly closer, ready to offer support if needed. The doctors told me he needed care, supervision, someone to watch over him during recovery. I did what I thought was the right thing. I hired the best medical team money could buy and set them up in his house in Connecticut. Then I went back to work. Jackson paused, a flicker of shame crossing his features. What I'm trying to say is that I've spent years perfecting the art of throwing money at problems rather than presence, of being physically absent but financially supportive, of building a better world while neglecting the very person who taught me what better should mean. He turned fully toward his father now, speaking directly to him rather than the audience. Dad, I'm sorry it took watching a stranger show you the simple kindness I should have been offering to make me see what I've been doing. I'm sorry that I've let success become a wall between us rather than a bridge. Most of all, I'm sorry that I needed this moment, in front of hundreds of people, to finally say what should have been said in private long ago. Walter shook his head, mouthing words that Abigail couldn't hear but that clearly conveyed forgiveness. The raw emotion of the moment was palpable, spreading through the room and transforming what had begun as a standard charity event into something unexpectedly authentic. Jackson turned back to the microphone. So instead of talking about the future of technology tonight, I want to talk about a different kind of innovation, the kind that happens when we remember to put human connection above advancement, compassion above convenience, and presence above productivity. For the next 20 minutes, Jackson spoke with passion about the literacy program the gala was supporting, weaving in personal stories of how his father's dedication as a teacher had shaped not just his own life, but the lives of generations of students. He announced that Horizon would match every dollar raised that night, then doubled down by pledging to develop a free digital library platform accessible to schools in underserved communities. By the time he concluded his speech, donations had surpassed all previous records for the event. The crowd rose in a standing ovation as Jackson helped his father from the stage, this time needing no assistance from Abigail or anyone else. As the formal program transitioned to the evening's entertainment, Abigail slipped back into her role, directing staff, resolving minor crises, and ensuring the remainder of the gala proceeded smoothly. She was checking on a table that had requested a dietary accommodation when she felt a presence behind her. "Miss," Jackson Hayes's voice made her turn in surprise. "Porter," she supplied. "Abigail Porter." "Miss Porter," he repeated, his tone respectful rather than dismissive. "My father would like to speak with you if you can spare a moment." Abigail glanced around, assessing her responsibilities. Finding nothing urgent, she nodded. "Of course." Jackson led her to a quiet corner where Walter was seated, looking tired but content after the evening's emotional events. The elderly man brightened when he saw her approach. "There she is," Walter said warmly, "the angel who saved me from making a fool of myself on those treacherous stairs." Abigail smiled, genuinely touched by his description. "It was no trouble, Mr. Hayes. It's part of my job to ensure everyone at our events is comfortable." "Nonsense," Walter dismissed with a wave of his hand. "I watched you all evening, young lady. You're the only staff member who bothered to see a lonely old man instead of just another chair to be filled. That's not job description, that's character." Jackson remained silent, watching the interaction with interest. "You're very kind," Abigail replied, feeling slightly uncomfortable under the dual scrutiny of father and son. "But I should probably get back to work. The event coordinator will be looking for me." "Actually," Walter said, leaning forward conspirationally, I have a proposition for you. Abigail raised an eyebrow, uncertain what to expect. My son and I are having a bit of a family reunion dinner tomorrow night, Walter explained. Nothing fancy, just catching up after too long apart. But I find myself in need of an ally, someone to help keep the conversation flowing when this workaholic inevitably checks his phone. He jerked a thumb toward Jackson, who had the grace to look chagrined. Would you consider joining us, as my guest, of course? Abigail blinked in surprise, caught completely off guard by the invitation. She glanced at Jackson, expecting to see annoyance or reluctance, but his expression was unreadable. I don't know if that would be appropriate, she stammered, professional boundaries suddenly blurring in a way that made her uneasy. Dad, Jackson interjected gently. Miss Porter probably has plans of her own. We shouldn't put her on the spot. Nonsense, Walter replied, with the confidence of a man who had spent decades in a classroom managing reluctant students. Everyone has to eat dinner. Besides, I owe her a proper thank you, and I've always believed gratitude tastes better with good food. He turned expectant eyes to Abigail. What do you say, dear? Just dinner my treat at the Preston on 5th. 7 o'clock. Abigail hesitated, torn between professional caution and genuine affection for the charming older man. There was something in Walter's invitation that suggested more than simple gratitude, a hint of mischief, perhaps, or something deeper she couldn't quite identify. Before she could formulate a response, a commotion near the main entrance drew their attention. Security personnel were converging on a woman who appeared to be arguing with the check-in staff, her voice rising above the music and conversation. I don't need an invitation, the woman insisted loudly. Jackson Hayes will want to see me. Just tell him Charlotte is here. Jackson's posture stiffened immediately at the name, and Abigail watched as his expression shifted from curiosity to grim resignation. Excuse me, he said tightly, already moving toward the disturbance. I need to handle this. Walter sighed heavily, shaking his head as his son walked away. Some ghosts, he murmured, never stay buried. He turned back to Abigail, his earlier cheerfulness dimmed but not extinguished. Tomorrow at 7, Miss Porter. No need to answer now, just know the invitation stands. As Abigail returned to her duties, she couldn't help watching the unfolding drama by the entrance. Jackson was now speaking intently to the woman, Charlotte, who wore an expression that cycled rapidly between anger, hurt, and calculation. There was clearly history there, complicated and unresolved. What Abigail couldn't possibly know then was how that history would soon collide with her own future, drawing her into a world far removed from the ordered predictability of her life as an event coordinator at the Hawthorne Hotel. By noon the next day, Abigail had almost convinced herself to decline Walter's dinner invitation. She sat in the staff break room at the Hawthorne, picking at a salad while scrolling through news articles about the previous night's gala on her phone. Multiple publications had covered the event, focusing on Jackson Hayes' surprisingly personal speech and the record-breaking donations. A few mentioned the touching moment when an unidentified staff member helped the elderly father of the billionaire to the stage. Unidentified, anonymous, invisible, the usual state of affairs in her line of work. You're famous, Porter, said Marcus, the head of security, dropping a newspaper on the table beside her. Well, almost. The paper featured a photograph from the gala. Walter at the podium with Jackson standing nearby, and just visible at the edge of the frame, Abigail's profile as she watched from the side of the stage. The caption read, Hayes delivers emotional tribute with father and assistant. I'm not his assistant, she murmured, pushing the paper away. Tell that to page 6, Marcus replied with a grin. Word is that Charlotte Warner made quite a scene after you left. Had to escort her out myself. Abigail's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Charlotte Warner? The fashion designer? Marcus nodded. Jackson Hayes' ex-fiancée. They broke up about a year ago. Very messy, very public. She showed up last night uninvited, claimed she needed to talk to him. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. Rumor has it she's been trying to get back with him ever since he became one of the 50 richest men in America. The revelation made Abigail uncomfortable, though she couldn't precisely articulate why. Perhaps it was the reminder of just how different Jackson Hayes' world was from her own, how unlikely the dinner invitation now seemed in the harsh light of day. Or perhaps it was the strange pang she felt at the thought of the beautiful, successful Charlotte Warner fighting to reclaim her place in the billionaire's life. Speak of the devil, Marcus muttered suddenly, straightening up. Abigail followed his gaze to the break room doorway, where Lisa, the front desk manager, stood with a look of barely contained excitement. "Abigail," Lisa called, too loudly for the small space. "There's someone asking for you at reception." With a sense of foreboding, Abigail made her way to the hotel lobby, where a uniformed driver stood holding a small cream-colored envelope. "Miss Porter?" he inquired politely. When she nodded, he handed her the envelope with a slight bow. "Mr. Walter Hayes asked me to deliver this personally and to await your response." Conscious of Lisa's curious stare from behind the reception desk, Abigail opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on heavy stationery. "Miss Porter, in case you're having second thoughts about our dinner invitation, and my son assures me you are, I wanted to reiterate how much your company would mean to this old man. Jackson will be tied up with meetings until 6:30, leaving me alone with nothing but my thoughts and a glass of overpriced Manhattan bourbon. Save me from such a fate. The car will return for you at 6:30 if you say yes. With gratitude, Walter Hayes, P.S. If it helps your decision, I've been told I tell excellent stories about my son's embarrassing childhood moments. Wouldn't you like to know about the science fair disaster of 1992? Despite herself, Abigail smiled. There was something irresistibly charming about Walter Hayes, a genuineness that contrasted sharply with the calculated interactions she typically experienced in her professional life. "Please tell Mr. Hayes I would be honored to join him for dinner," she told the driver, making a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. That evening, after rushing home to change into a simple navy blue dress and heels, the nicest outfit she owned that wasn't explicitly work attire, Abigail found herself seated in the back of a sleek black town car, being whisked through Manhattan traffic toward the Preston, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. As the car pulled up to the restaurant's discreet entrance, her momentary confidence wavered. What was she doing here? This wasn't her world. She was about to dine with one of the wealthiest men in the country and his father, a man who, despite his humble demeanor, had raised a business titan and moved in circles she could scarcely imagine. The driver opened her door, interrupting her spiral of self-doubt. "Mr. Hayes is already seated inside, Miss Porter. They're expecting you." Taking a deep breath, Abigail stepped from the car and walked through the restaurant's entrance, where the maitre d' greeted her by name and immediately led her to a private dining area in the back of the restaurant. Walter was already there, his face lighting up when he saw her. "You came," he exclaimed, attempting to rise from his seat before Abigail gestured for him to stay comfortable. "Your note was very persuasive," she replied with a genuine smile. "I'm particularly interested in this science fair disaster you mentioned." Walter's eyes twinkled. "All in good time, my dear. Jackson should be joining us shortly, unless some crisis in Tokyo demands his attention again." There was affection in his mild criticism, the comfortable ribbing of a father who knew his son's weaknesses, but loved him anyway. As they settled into conversation, Abigail found herself relaxing. Walter was a natural storyteller, drawing her out with questions about her life and work. While sharing anecdotes from his years as a teacher, she learned that he had taught high school physics for nearly 4 decades in a small Connecticut town, retiring just 5 years ago when his health began to decline. "And what about your family?" Walter asked as they sipped pre-dinner drinks. "Do they live in New York as well?" Abigail shook her head. "My parents are both gone. Dad when I was 12, Mom just after I finished college. I have an older brother in Seattle, but we're not particularly close." "I'm sorry to hear that," Walter said, his expression softening. "Family is precious. Sometimes we don't realize how precious until it's nearly too late." He glanced toward the entrance where Jackson Hayes had appeared, deep in conversation with the maitre d'. Jackson looked different tonight, still impeccably dressed in what was undoubtedly a custom suit, but somehow less formidable than he had seemed at the gala. When he spotted Abigail, surprise flickered across his features before he smoothed it away with a practiced smile. "Miss Porter," he said as he approached the table, "I'm glad you could join us. I apologize for my lateness. A situation in our Berlin office needed attention." "No need for formalities, son," Walter interjected. "Abigail and I are already on a first-name basis, aren't we, my dear?" She nodded, though in truth they had established no such thing. Still, there was something liberating about being Abigail rather than Miss Porter or the event coordinator. As dinner progressed, Abigail observed the dynamic between father and son with fascination. There was clear affection, but also tension, years of distance and different priorities creating a gap they were both trying to bridge. Walter drew out stories of Jackson's childhood as promised, including the infamous science fair incident where a 12-year-old Jackson had accidentally set fire to the gymnasium with an overly ambitious solar energy demonstration. The principal wanted to suspend him, Walter recalled, eyes crinkling with mirth, but the science teacher argued he should get an A for proving his hypothesis, perhaps too effectively. Jackson shook his head, but he was smiling. Dad conveniently leaves out the part where he had to work weekends for a month to pay for the damage. Worth every hour, Walter replied with obvious pride. The easy banter continued through the main course, and Abigail found herself increasingly comfortable, contributing her own stories and observations. Jackson, she discovered, possessed a dry wit that rarely emerged in his public persona, and he listened with genuine interest when she spoke about her work at the Hawthorne. It was during dessert that the evening took an unexpected turn. Walter was mid-anecdote when a well-dressed woman approached their table, her confident stride and perfect posture marking her as someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Jackson," the woman said smoothly. "What a delightful coincidence." Abigail knew immediately who she was. Charlotte Warner in the flesh was even more striking than in photographs. Tall and elegant, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of bone structure that makeup artists dreamed of, she exuded confident sophistication. Her gaze swept over Walter with polite acknowledgement before landing on Abigail with cool assessment. "Charlotte," Jackson responded, his voice neutral but his posture suddenly tense. "I wasn't aware you frequented the Preston." "A recent discovery," she replied with a practiced smile. "I'm meeting with potential investors for my new line." She turned to Abigail. "And you are—" Before Abigail could answer, Walter interjected, "This is Abigail Porter, a dear friend who was kind enough to join an old man for dinner." Charlotte's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. "How lovely!" Her tone suggested it was anything but. She turned back to Jackson. "We need to talk, Jackie. About us, about the future. I've been doing a lot of thinking since—" "Charlotte," Jackson cut her off firmly, "this isn't the time or place." Something flashed in Charlotte's eyes, hurt, quickly masked by determination. "It never is it? You've been avoiding me for months. My calls, my messages." She glanced again at Abigail, a calculated move. "I suppose I understand why now." Abigail felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment and something like indignation. The implication was clear and completely inaccurate. "Miss Warner," Walter said, his voice carrying unexpected authority despite his age, "my son and I are enjoying a private dinner with a friend who showed great kindness to me yesterday. I'm sure whatever business you have with Jackson can wait for a more appropriate moment." Charlotte seemed taken aback by the direct confrontation from the elderly man. She recovered quickly, producing a business card from her clutch and placing it on the table beside Jackson's water glass. "Call me," she said simply, then turned and walked away, the confidence in her stride undiminished. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Abigail stared at her half-eaten chocolate soufflé, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a private family drama. "Well," Walter finally said, his tone deliberately light, "she seems determined." Jackson exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face in a rare display of uncalculated emotion. "Dad, please." "What?" Walter responded innocently. "I'm just making an observation. Charlotte always did know exactly what she wanted." He turned to Abigail. "They were engaged for nearly 2 years, you know. Broke it off just before the wedding. A mutual decision, according to the press, though I always wondered—" "Dad," Jackson's voice held a warning. Walter raised his hands in surrender. "Fine, fine. None of my business. Though I will say," he added with a meaningful look at his son, "that some chapters need proper endings before new ones can begin." The atmosphere at the table had shifted, layers of unspoken tension now hovering beneath the surface. Abigail sensed she had inadvertently stepped into a complex web of relationships and history she didn't fully understand and wasn't sure she wanted to. "Perhaps I should go," she suggested quietly, reaching for her purse. "It's getting late and you both probably have a lot to discuss." "Nonsense," Walter said firmly. "The evening is young and we haven't even gotten to the good stories yet." He reached across the table, placing a weathered hand over hers. "Please stay, Abigail. I promise not to embarrass my son any further, at least not intentionally." She hesitated, looking to Jackson for guidance. His expression was unreadable for a moment, then softened into something like resignation mixed with curiosity. "My father is right," he said, surprising her. "Please stay. As she settled back into her chair, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold, stepping from the safely anonymous periphery of the Hayes family drama into its complicated center. What she couldn't possibly anticipate was how completely her life was about to change, or the role she would play in healing wounds that had festered long before she entered the picture. 1 week later, Abigail stood in front of her apartment mirror, barely recognizing herself. The woman reflected back wore a deep green dress that complemented her auburn hair and fair skin, a designer piece that had arrived that morning with a note from Walter. For our gallery adventure. No arguments. Consider it payment for putting up with 2 Hayes men for an entire evening. Despite her initial protests when Walter had called to invite her to the Whitney Museum's new exhibition opening, she found herself looking forward to the evening. The past week had been a whirlwind of unexpected connections. Lunch with Walter in Central Park, where he'd regaled her with stories of Jackson's teenage years, a surprise visit from Jackson himself to the Hawthorne, ostensibly to discuss hosting a corporate event, but somehow ending with them sharing coffee in the hotel's quiet garden courtyard, talking about books and travel and dreams deferred. Her phone chimed with a text message. Car downstairs in 5. Walter insisting I remind you to wear comfortable shoes despite the fancy dress. His words exactly. J.H. Abigail smiled, slipping her feet into elegant but sensible flats. In just a week, she'd grown accustomed to Jackson's direct communication style. No flowery language, no unnecessary words, but a surprising thoughtfulness beneath the efficiency. Downstairs she found not the town car she expected, but Jackson himself, leaning against a vintage Aston Martin, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him in dark jeans and a charcoal blazer. Dad decided to meet us there, he explained as he opened the passenger door. Something about giving young people space to breathe. Abigail laughed, settling into the butter-soft leather seat. Subtle, isn't he? About as subtle as a physics teacher with a matchmaking agenda, Jackson agreed, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile as he slid behind the wheel. I should apologize for him, but you're not actually sorry, she finished for him, surprised by her own boldness. His smile widened as he pulled into traffic. No, I'm not. The easy rapport they'd developed over the past week continued as they drove through the city, discussing everything from the exhibition they were about to see to Abigail's background in hospitality management. She found herself sharing things she rarely discussed, her original dream of opening her own boutique hotel, the financial realities that had forced her to set that dream aside after her mother's lengthy illness, drained her savings, her determination to work her way back toward that goal. Why the Hawthorne? Jackson asked as they neared the museum. You could be managing events anywhere with your experience. Abigail considered the question. It has character, history. It's not part of some corporate chain where every decision requires approval from executives who've never set foot in the building. She paused. I like being part of something with roots, I guess. Jackson nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his features. Roots matter, he said quietly, and she sensed he was thinking of his father. At the museum, Walter was waiting, dapper in a tweed jacket and bow tie, leaning on his cane but looking stronger than he had at the gala. He greeted Abigail with genuine warmth, and she was struck again by how comfortable she felt with this man she'd known for such a short time. The exhibition was a collection of contemporary American artists exploring themes of connection and isolation in the digital age, a subject that sparked lively debate among the 3 of them as they moved through the galleries. Walter's perspective as someone who had witnessed the entire evolution of modern technology offered a fascinating counterpoint to Jackson's insider knowledge of the industry. The irony, Walter observed, as they studied a painting depicting people in a crowded room all staring at their phones, is that the tools designed to connect us have made it easier to avoid real connection. That's oversimplifying, Dad, Jackson countered. Technology has created communities for people who would have been isolated in previous generations. It's given voice to those who were voiceless. At what cost, though? Abigail found herself asking. I see it every day at the hotel. People traveling together but barely speaking, each in their own digital bubble. Their philosophical discussion continued through the exhibition and into dinner at a small Italian restaurant nearby, where Walter insisted on hearing more about Abigail's hotel dreams. You should talk to Rachel Winters, Walter suggested, as they shared tiramisu. She restored that beautiful hotel in Newport. What was it called, Jackson? The Harbour View, Jackson supplied. And yes, Rachel would be a good contact. I can introduce you if you'd like. Abigail hesitated. That's very generous, but I don't want special treatment, Jackson finished for her, his expression knowing. It's not charity, Abigail. It's networking. Something tells me Rachel would be impressed by your vision, with or without my name attached to the introduction. Before she could respond, a commotion at the restaurant entrance drew their attention. Charlotte Warner had arrived with a small entourage, her laughter carrying across the room as she was led to a table on the opposite side of the restaurant. Remarkable coincidence, Walter muttered, his tone suggesting he believed it was anything but. Jackson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Ignore it, he said quietly. She's trying to force a conversation I'm not ready to have. The atmosphere at their table had shifted, a familiar tension descending. Abigail studied Jackson's face, seeing beyond the composed exterior to the conflict beneath. Maybe you should have that conversation, she suggested gently. Not now, not here, but soon. Unresolved endings have a way of poisoning new beginnings. Both Hayes men looked at her with surprise, though Walter's quickly transformed into approval. Wise beyond your years, the older man said with a nod. Wouldn't you agree, son? Jackson didn't answer immediately, his gaze still on Abigail, thoughtful and assessing. Perhaps, he finally acknowledged. But some conversations are complicated by history. All the more reason not to let that history fester, she replied. The evening concluded without further incident, Charlotte apparently content with making her presence known without direct confrontation. As they prepared to leave, Walter announced that he was tired and would take a separate car home, a transparent ploy that neither Jackson nor Abigail called him on. The drive back to Abigail's apartment was quieter than the journey to the museum, a comfortable silence punctuated by occasional observations about the exhibition or the city passing by outside the windows. When they arrived, Jackson insisted on walking her to her door, a fourth-floor walk-up in a pre-war building in Morningside Heights. I had a lovely time, she said, as they reached her apartment, suddenly feeling awkward, caught between the easy friendship they'd developed and an undeniable awareness of something more hovering at its edges. So did I, Jackson replied, studying her face with an intensity that made her heart race. Abigail, The shrill ring of his phone cut through the moment. He glanced at the screen, grimaced and declined the call. Charlotte, Abigail guessed. He nodded, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. I should deal with that situation. You're right about unresolved endings. Yes, you should, she agreed, ignoring the inexplicable pang of disappointment that accompanied her words. Good night, Jackson. He hesitated, then leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. Good night, Abigail. 3 days passed without word from either Hayes, and Abigail tried to convince herself it was for the best. Whatever had been developing, friendship, attraction, or something undefined, was complicated by circumstances far beyond her control. Better to step back now, before she became too invested in a world where she didn't belong. She threw herself into work, coordinating a last-minute wedding reception for a celebrity couple and managing the logistics of a United Nations delegation staying at the Hawthorne. It was during a rare quiet moment on the 4th day, as she updated inventory spreadsheets in her small office, that her desk phone rang. Event planning, this is Abigail, she answered automatically. Miss Porter, came a familiar southern-tinged voice. I believe I'm in need of your expertise. Mr. Hayes, she replied, unable to suppress a smile. Walter, I mean, what can I help you with? I find myself in possession of a lake house in the Adirondacks that hasn't seen proper use in years, Walter explained. Jackson used to love it there as a boy, but these days he claims to be too busy for weekend retreats. I thought perhaps a small gathering, close friends, good food, no business talk allowed, might remind him that life exists outside of board meetings and product launches. Abigail's professional instincts kicked in immediately. When were you thinking, and how many guests? This weekend, Walter said, as if it were the most reasonable time frame in the world. Just a handful of people. Jackson's oldest friend from college and his wife, my neighbor from Connecticut and her daughter, and you, of course. Me? Abigail faltered. I thought you wanted my professional assistance in planning. Oh, the planning's all done, Walter assured her. Chef hired, boats readied, rooms prepared. No, my dear, I'm inviting you as a guest, someone who can appreciate good company and perhaps help keep my son from checking his phone every 5 minutes. Abigail hesitated. The invitation was tempting. A weekend in the Adirondacks sounded like heaven after months without a proper break. but the boundaries between her professional and personal relationship with the Hayes men were becoming increasingly blurred. "I'm not sure it would be appropriate," she began carefully. "Appropriate," Walter repeated, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Abigail, at my age, I've learned that appropriate is often just another word for safe. Sometimes the most valuable experiences come from stepping outside those carefully drawn lines." Before she could formulate a response, he continued, his voice softening. "The truth is, my dear, you've brought something back to our lives, to Jackson's life, that's been missing for a long time. Perspective, genuine connection, the ability to be present in a moment instead of always looking ahead to the next challenge, the next milestone." "Walter, You don't have to answer now," he interjected gently. "The invitation stands. A car will be ready at your apartment at noon on Friday, should you decide to join us. No pressure, no expectations, just good company and a chance to breathe mountain air." After they hung up, Abigail sat at her desk, torn between practicality and the undeniable pull of connection she'd felt with both Hayes men. Her rational mind listed all the reasons to decline: the inappropriate blending of professional and personal boundaries, the complicated history with Charlotte that remained unresolved, the vast differences between her world and theirs. Her heart, however, remembered Jackson's genuine interest in her dreams, Walter's warm acceptance, and the sense of belonging she'd felt in their company, despite all the reasons she shouldn't. Friday arrived, and at 11:55, Abigail stood on the curb outside her apartment building, a weekend bag at her feet, still uncertain if she was making the right decision. At precisely noon, a car pulled up, not the town car or chauffeur she expected, but Jackson himself in a Range Rover, window rolling down to reveal his surprised but pleased expression. "You decided to come," he said, getting out to take her bag. "Your father is very persuasive," she replied with a small smile. "That he is," Jackson agreed, stowing her bag in the back. "Though I should confess something before we start this drive." He turned to face her fully. "I asked him to invite you." Abigail blinked, processing this revelation. "You did?" Jackson nodded, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his expression. "After our evening at the museum, I realized something important. I needed to resolve things with Charlotte before I could—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Explore whatever this is between us." "And did you?" Abigail asked, her heart beating faster. "Resolve things with Charlotte?" "Yes," he said simply. "It was a long conversation, years overdue. She deserved honesty about why our relationship failed, and I needed to acknowledge my part in that failure." He paused. "We were together for the wrong reasons. She wanted the status of being with me, and I wanted someone who fit perfectly into the life I thought I should have. Neither of us was being authentic." "And now?" Abigail prompted softly. Jackson's expression softened. "Now I find myself drawn to someone who has never once been impressed by my bank account or business achievements. Someone who sees my father not as an obligation, but as the remarkable man he is. Someone who challenges me to be present rather than perfect." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of grey in his blue eyes. "I know this is unexpected. I know there are complications and questions and 1,000 reasons why you might want to get back in that building and pretend we never met. But I'm asking you to take a chance. Not on some fairy tale romance, but on the possibility that sometimes life's most meaningful connections come from the most unexpected places." Abigail stood silent for a moment, weighing everything. The unlikeliness of their meeting, the genuine connection that had grown so quickly, the potential for heartbreak, the possibility of something real and lasting. "I talked to my boss yesterday," she said finally, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "Requested a proper vacation, 2 weeks. Relief and joy transformed Jackson's features. 2 weeks, huh? That's quite a commitment for someone who hasn't taken more than a weekend off in years." "Well," she replied, her eyes twinkling with newfound courage, "I've been advised recently that the most valuable experiences come from stepping outside carefully drawn lines." Jackson laughed, the sound genuine and unburdened. "My father's wisdom strikes again." He opened the passenger door with a flourish. "Shall we? The mountain air awaits, and a very smug old man is probably already setting an extra place at the dinner table." As they drove north out of the city, Abigail felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Whatever the future held, whether a weekend of discovery or the beginning of something more enduring, she knew that a simple act of kindness on a gala night had altered the course of 3 lives in ways none of them could have predicted. 6 months later, the Hawthorne Hotel hosted a different kind of event. The launch of a foundation dedicated to supporting elderly teachers. founded by Walter and Jackson Hayes. As guests mingled and champagne flowed, Abigail stood on the stage beside the two men who had become the most important people in her life, watching Walter prepare to address the crowd. "Need a hand?" she asked softly, offering her arm as she had on that first night. Walter's eyes twinkled with mischief and satisfaction. "Not any more, my dear," he replied, standing straight and strong. "Though I must say, pretending to need help that night was the smartest thing I've ever done." Jackson, overhearing, shook his head in amused disbelief. "You were faking." "Not entirely," Walter admitted with a wink. "But I might have exaggerated a bit when I saw this lovely young woman noticing an old man everyone else had forgotten." He patted Abigail's hand where it rested in the crook of Jackson's arm. Sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as small acts of kindness. As Walter stepped forward to address the gathered guests, Jackson turned to Abigail, love evident in his expression. "He's right, you know. That night changed everything. For all of us," she agreed, thinking of her newly opened boutique hotel in Connecticut, a dream made possible by her own determination and the support of the man beside her. Not a gift, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared vision. Walter's voice rang out across the ballroom, strong and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the beginning of something extraordinary, a foundation built on the belief that no one should be forgotten, that wisdom deserves recognition, and that sometimes the smallest gesture of kindness can change lives in ways we never imagined." As the crowd applauded, Abigail reflected on how a single moment of seeing someone everyone else had overlooked had led to healing, connection, and love, proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest acts of genuine human kindness.